Welcome to Trust the Badge. Today, I'm honored to introduce a remarkable guest, Congressman Marc Molinaro, representing New York's 19th Congressional District. Congressman Molinaro has a long and distinguished career in public service, from serving as a village mayor to a county executive. Now in Congress, he's been a strong advocate for law enforcement, public safety, and mental health services. We are going to discuss his journey to Congress, his views on public safety, and the initiatives he supports to foster a stronger relationship between law enforcement and the communities they serve. Welcome, Congressman Molinaro.
I'm glad to be with you. I'm Marc Molinaro. I'm a congressman from upstate New York. Serving in my first term, represent the second largest district actually in New York State, NY-19. If you know New York and the Northeast at all, it stretches from where New York meets Massachusetts all the way out to a school town called Ithaca, New York. I come to Congress having served the last 12 years as a county executive, kind of like a county mayor or manager elected to serve a community of 300,000 people, $550 million municipal budget, 1,700 employees. But before that, I served 7 years in the state assembly, New York's state legislature, the lower house. And before that, 12 years as a village mayor. And so it's fair to say I've spent my entire adult life trying to make government actually work for people. Knowing what you cover and knowing what we're going to talk about, I will just tell you that I spent a lot of time really not only supporting law enforcement, but really trying to enhance mental health services, intervention services, so that we can drive down incidents of crime and hopefully help people either prevent criminal behavior or even transition out of it and create a safer community and enhance the way in which we provide for public safety. So thrilled to be with you, glad to be with you, and happy to talk with you.
Well, thank you for being here, Congressman. Again, for everyone that's listening, that is Congressman Marc Molinaro representing New York, who was recently elected, and I'm glad to have him on the podcast. To start off, what story or issue encouraged you to run for Congress?
Sure. Actually, it was the end of the pandemic. I mean, quite frankly, as a county executive, my job was to provide for public health. In fact, in New York, it's county governments that do the public health response. And I'll say this: early on in COVID, we didn't know what we didn't know, and so there were a lot of decisions that needed to be made. But then after time, clearly we knew information, and governments were making decisions that just didn't make any sense. In fact, were not only imposing on small businesses, but sometimes weren't even protecting the health of senior citizens or those living with intellectual disabilities. And I saw this and began to see really my federal government and my representative not engaging in a way that would help guide us out of that economic shutdown and pandemic and really right some wrongs. And so I decided to run because I just felt that, like most Americans, and I'm sure you feel this way too, to some degree, right? We just get frustrated by a government that doesn't respect the people it serves, isn't respectful of its role, and too often makes decisions without concern for how they affect ordinary families, farmers, in my case, and small businesses. So I was compelled, after all those years of holding a public office, using all of the relationships and experience I had to try to make a case to speak for communities in the part of New York State that often get overlooked. And so really just decided that I'd use my experience, I'd use my relationships, and I'd use ultimately the need to give voice to this community as a reason to stand up and fight for upstate New York.
Thank you for sharing that story. And speaking of why you ran, could you just share with us some of the typical things that you advocate for in your district?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, listen, even in New York, and I shouldn't say even in New York, but in New York, just like where you are, we face some of the same challenges. First, public safety, whether it's responding to the lack of border security. This president, this administration has surrendered the southern border to drug cartels. It's as clear as that. Human trafficking, fentanyl and synthetic opioid trafficking, and over the course of the last 4 years, some 10 million individuals illegally entering into the country. Of course, we need a system that helps people enter this country legally. Of course, we need a system that respects those who might be fleeing oppression or indiscriminate poverty. But that doesn't mean we would allow for what this president has allowed to happen. And because of it, it's undermining public safety. And every community across the country is a border community. Now, fast forward or expand that to New York State. New York is a sanctuary city, and New York State has declared itself a sanctuary state. These policies incentivize illegal behavior, and they impose upon communities like the ones I represent in ways that undermine public safety. So, public safety, border security, supporting law enforcement, for me, job growth and economic activity. I'm sure you can't walk very far or drive very far in Florida and not find a New Yorker, a former New Yorker. And so, because of that, New York has led the nation in out migration. More people leave New York to other states than any other state in the country, and that's just left us struggling to grow job opportunities, economic opportunities, and those are the things that we fight for. Right now, I'll also tell you, I care deeply about those who struggle hard, and we talk a lot and advocate a lot, not only for interventions and treatments for those dealing with substance use disorder or drug use, but also those living with mental wellness and mental illness concerns. And very especially to me, is advocating for and standing up for those with intellectual, physical, and developmental disabilities.
Because we're discussing what you advocate for, I just want to bring up something that I read recently about how you are supporting law enforcement in New York. Could you explain what the bill to counter New York's bail reform is?
Sure. So first, let's explain it, right?
Yeah.
And this is going to be somewhat foreign to folks at least close to you, but people who listen to you will maybe from outside the area will get it. New York State ended basically bail, established cashless bail, and because of it, what we see is individuals who are a risk to themselves and others just being turned right back onto the streets, having committed crimes. In some cases, committing multiple numbers of crimes, many more victims. And we don't, in this state, in New York, the state policy prohibits law enforcement from intervening until they're horrific crimes, and that's just not something that's acceptable. So, two pieces
Right.
of legislation that we focused on. One is frankly, if the federal government's giving states resources, funding, then states need to respect the judicial process, give judges and prosecutors and others the ability to protect the safety of communities and families and individuals that live in those communities. And so our bill would preclude states like New York from accessing some federal funds unless they address cashless bail. The other, I just would say as a side, as it relates to border security as well, is our Schools Not Shelters Act, which is meant to say very clearly, you cannot convert public schools, New York City did, into housing shelters for undocumented individuals. It's not acceptable. It displaces students. It undermines the ability to provide education. And in many cases, just makes it more difficult for families in particular in New York City, but in others, to get the services that schools often provide after school hours, early breakfast, after school activities, intervention services for those with disabilities. And so we just say that that's not acceptable. And our bill would preclude states from using public schools as shelters for undocumented individuals.
I think that is an important issue that does need to be covered. What are your views on the current state of trust between law enforcement and the community in New York, and what steps need to be taken to improve it if needed?
Yeah. Well, first, let's say this: overwhelmingly, Americans trust, respect, and support the men and women of law enforcement.
I agree.
Overwhelmingly, we understand and recognize the sacrifice they make, the sacrifice their families make, and the hard work and dedication they commit to providing for public safety. Sadly, far too many, and sadly, communities, right, elected officials have vilified law enforcement. And because of it, it's not only undermined our ability to provide for public safety, but it's made the job of being a police officer more dangerous. And because of that, there is an erosion among some and in some communities of trust and respect. When I was a village mayor a long, long time ago, I encouraged our law enforcement officials to be out on the streets, on their feet, interacting with neighbors and community members. We ran a safe stops program where we had officers out on the street just walking between school bus stops, not because we wanted to impose on anybody. We wanted to ensure the relationship between the people we serve and the men and women who provide for our protection, that relationship existed, was strong, and was respectful. We've lost a lot of that, and we have to gain it back. And so the way that you do that is first by as anyone in leadership should not be in the position of demonizing or vilifying law enforcement, period. That shouldn't be. If there's improvements to be made, we point to them. If there are enhancements to policy, we want them. If we can provide training and resources to make their jobs easier and have them do their jobs even better, we want to do that. But we have to stop vilifying and demonizing law enforcement. Certainly, we need governments to fund law enforcement. This concept of defunding or no funding for law enforcement, it's ridiculous. It has caused for increases in crime and undermining public safety. And then in places like New York, we have to confront policies that clearly put people who choose to commit crimes before the victims and before the people trying to prevent those crimes. And so we all those things have to happen together to restore a sense of decency, a sense of right and wrong, and ultimately strengthen the ability to provide for public safety.
I completely agree that we need to end the notion of vilifying all of law enforcement because from what we've seen over the past few years, especially with the Defund the Police movement, many law enforcement agencies across the nation have been defunded because of one officer's action. What legislative measures do you support or propose to enhance the transparency within law enforcement agencies, if there are any?
Yeah. So, I mean, first, as I kind of hinted to, is when I was a village mayor, we've got to do more to support community policing. Police officers are from and want to be part of the community. And so giving them the ability through adequate pay, adequate training, adequate resources and tools to be out in the community, interacting with community leaders, faith leaders, neighborhoods, and businesses. That in and of itself creates a relationship that helps weather some of the more difficult times. So that to me is critically important. Now, I've worked as a member of Congress to deliver direct aid and funds to law enforcement agencies, competitive grants, support for mental health and crisis intervention training. And giving law enforcement the tools, police officers the tools to do their job. Some cases, we've advocated for the actual tools themselves, ATVs, so they're out in trails and parks, jet skis, so they're out on water bodies for interacting with folks that are out making use of rivers and lakes. These are the kinds of things that again they need in order to do their jobs well, but also provide a relationship and a connection that I think is important. The concept of providing transparency, law enforcement's willing to make those leaps. When I was a county executive, even still now, I support giving the police officers the ability to engage with community, allow community members to ask questions and have those interactions in a respectful way. And law enforcement welcomes that. I also want to give law enforcement the tools like body cameras so that they can do the jobs and provide not only transparency but protection for themselves. Those are tools that, again, law enforcement embraces and wants. We just have to make sure they have them, and then ultimately they have not only the tools but adequate training, mental health first aid, trauma informed care, crisis intervention. These are all things that give law enforcement the ability to de-escalate criminal activity and provide ultimately for a much safer community and provide safety for themselves.
Those are two great points because resources and training is really what law enforcement needs in today's world, especially to build trust. Body cams have been a huge bonus for both sides to really enhance that trust, and we've seen that it's completely effective. Now that we've talked about law enforcement, what about the community? What role should community engagement play in strengthening the relationship?
Well, I mean, bluntly, a big role, and too often, elected officials don't want to have the community conversations necessary to provide for respect between law enforcement and the community, and ultimately public safety. And so sometimes what we do is we expect law enforcement to take the lead on those things. With all due respect, a local elected officials should be the ones convening the meetings, not in the aftermath, not only in the aftermath of crime and violence, but to prevent it. Have engaged conversations about what we want as a community. How do we hope to live as a community? How do we ensure public safety as a community? Let's talk about those priorities in a way that isn't adversarial and combative, isn't after the fact when folks have a lot of anger and animosity. Let's talk about them before, and let's build those relationships. Let's say to law enforcement that you have every right to be a part of community events, back to school or after school activities. We want you interacting at senior centers and in recreation facilities. We want you talking to the business owners in a way that they has to know that they can count on you. Building that basic relationship isn't only the job of law enforcement; it's the job of all of us. And elected officials should be taking the lead. Sometimes they just cower in the background. Elected officials should be right up front during the difficult conversations saying, how do we provide for public safety? Let's respect the men and women who sacrifice to do that. And how ultimately do we want to ensure moving forward that we learn lessons, right? We get better at what we do. Tomorrow, we should be better than what we do today. And ultimately, how do we provide for public safety together? And that's a responsibility of people who choose to be in elected office, public office. And it's also a responsibility of the community as well.
Absolutely. And I've spoken to a few sheriffs on the podcast as well who are elected officials and have started their process to actually hold these meetings with community leaders and business owners. These meetings mean a lot for the community because now everyone knows what they really want. Are there any other specific programs or initiatives that you endorse or advocate for to promote positive interactions and understanding between law enforcement and community members?
Yeah, I've talked a little bit about it, sort of generally.
Right.
There's a program I think called LEAD, which is useful. It connects law enforcement with other community leaders to confront sort of chronic criminal activity. There's an individual that you're gonna have to interact with more, or there's a problem spot in your community, and you get law enforcement, a faith or church or synagogue leader. You get a community leader. Maybe you even get a formerly incarcerated person who knows the system and wants to talk about how to improve things. Maybe you're getting mental health providers, and you're engaged in a conversation about the problem, and then trying to confront it from multiple angles. And that to me is a good model when you have sort of these flare-ups, right? These places and neighborhoods and corners of the community that really do need more than only a police officer engaged. You need to have others take part in it, right? It may be a sense that the whole community has to stick together and kind of confront that challenge. That's a good initiative. It's a good program. I think it's also important. I have a sheriff. I have 11 sheriffs, but one in my district, Fred Akshar. He's the sheriff of Broome County, New York. The city of Binghamton's there. What he does is just go out into the community. I think he does. It's a faith and cops kind of a program where all the church leaders get together, and he talks to them and members of the congregation about how they can be engaged in trying to provide for improved community safety and quality of life. He'll go out and talk at summer recreation programs where kids are and their families are, maybe visit with the after school programs to interact with kids. And so those kind of initiatives, they really work. And we shouldn't be surprised they work, because human beings like to be safe. Human beings like to interact with other human beings. And so when you're having that conversation and that interaction, you're building a respect for one another that's hard to break. And you also then have a community that says, when so-and-so or something gets difficult or violent or problematic, we're going to confront it together. And it just builds an investment, right? A relationship that helps you weather the more difficult storms that come up. And ultimately, by the way, ultimately prevent criminal behavior. Now, beyond that, transitional programming. So if you're an incarcerated person, you're coming out into the community, there ought to be transitional programs to help people transition back. Why? Because too many times, if you're in jail and you come back out in the community, sometimes we just drop you right back where you were, and those influences that made you or led you to criminal behavior or choosing to commit crimes, you're right back in that environment. Providing transitions outward into the community so that we can avoid recidivism, we can avoid repeat offenses. That's important too. So when I was a county executive, we invested in all these things. And over the course of 8 years, and I was county executive for 12, but over the course of 8 years, we reduced violent crime by 40%. Excuse me, let me say that again. We reduced violent crime by 50%, and we reduced the inmate population, people in jail, by 40%. And we did that because we understood that you got to get the whole community engaged. You can prevent crime, you can intervene at the right moment, and you can help people transition back more safely than we do it in many places now.
I've heard of similar programs, but this is a really unique one because it's actually showing results in New York.
Just so you know, it's prevention, intervention, diversion, transition. Work collectively to prevent criminal behavior. Intervene at the right moment before criminal behavior occurs, right? So prevention, intervention, diversion, those who shouldn't be directed toward a jail setting, but maybe a treatment center or something of that nature. Again, these are individuals that haven't yet been found guilty of something. Let's give them those services. And then if you're in jail and you're coming back out in the community at some point, there ought to be a transition back in. And it's all about providing safety for the community and giving law enforcement the tools to effectively do their jobs.
That is the goal, and I'm glad that you recognize it because I think more counties and districts should as well. Do you believe that law enforcement agencies should undergo additional training or reforms to better serve their communities? And if so, what specific steps would you support?
Well, let's say this. I have yet to find anyone in law enforcement that doesn't want to learn the next thing, right? You're always confronting something new. So the appropriate training is always necessary. And I think, and I did this, investing in the right training at the right moment, crisis intervention training, trauma-informed care, preventative measures, and giving law enforcement the training necessary to react in moments of real difficulty. Now, with skyrocketing numbers of amount of fentanyl coming into this country, synthetic opioids coming into this country, we see the growth in sadly individuals overdosing, individuals losing their lives to addiction and to drug use. It's important that we give law enforcement the training necessary to intervene. And so, yeah, so that's mental health first aid, that's crisis intervention training, so that they can meet that moment, de-escalate, get the individual out of that particular incident or situation, and ultimately to a treatment or even if it had to be an incarcerated setting, right, jail or prison, in order obviously to adjudicate a crime. But those kind of things are really important. Providing law enforcement access to the drugs that help and the tools that help address fentanyl overdoses, really important. Narcan, Opvi. There are other drugs that and medications that are used to assist in overdose situations. But I do think overall, giving law enforcement the ability to learn to meet the moment is always really important.
Speaking of mental health, I recently read this article about the Denver Police Department having a mental health social program. This program, when there is a mental health call or disturbance, not only do officers show up, but another mental health counselor shows up as well. Have you heard of the program and do you think it's a good idea?
Well, you can't see me smiling, but I'm smiling because that's actually an initiative we launched in Dutchess County. And when I was county executive, we actually are the model for the state of New York in responding to community-based mental health needs. And so having mobile intervention teams available that law enforcement can call out when they're needed is really important. The other thing that we did, which again I advocate for now in Congress, is we embedded mental health dispatchers, if you will, mental health first aid professionals. We embedded them in the 911 system. So many times, you're dialing 911, traditional emergency, you want to get the responder out immediately. But those who are dealing with mental health crisis, it could be an individual who's considering taking their own life. It could be an individual dealing with some mental health concern. Having a mental health provider on the 911 call, actually interacting with that individual while law enforcement, and if they choose a mental health team coming out to that individual, could save lives. It does in fact save lives significantly. So those kinds of things are really very important, and again, not only make the job of law enforcement better, easier, and more effective, but overall provide for greater public safety and enhance the life of the individuals you're trying to interact with.
What a surprise. Not only do you know about the program, but you actually started it in New York. Going back to the topic we were talking about earlier, the Defund the Police movement. So I've seen it across every headline just a few years ago. And one of the main reasons why I started Trust the Badge was because of how devastating the Defund the Police movement was. There was no voice for law enforcement. Now that's been a few years past the movement, what are your thoughts about it?
It has caused chaos, and it's absurd. Really on its face. The government's job is to provide for our protection. I mean, it is one of the fundamental roles of government at every level is to provide for our safety. And law enforcement and the men and women in law enforcement are those who put themselves on the line to protect us. Every night you go to bed, you might not know their names, you might not ever see them, but you do know in the back of your head that there's some police officer out there who's keeping us safe and secure. They're leaving their families. Their families worry as they're out that they may not come home. But the primary role of government is to provide for our protection, and law enforcement is the tool we use in our communities, within the borders of our country, to provide for our protection. The concept that anyone would think that you could function without those men and women standing on the line is just totally absurd. It is entirely wrong, and it has led, sadly, to chaos in too many places.
I couldn't agree more. And speaking for those law enforcement officers who were affected by the Defund the Police movement just a few years ago, I did feel quite bad for them because not only were many of their coworkers laid off, but they also had the discouragement to also leave their jobs. There's a very infamous example from Burlington, Vermont, where their city council decided to defund their local police department, and the goal was to reduce it about half of its size. What really happened was more than half left because not only were the intended officers laid off, but more police officers left because they did not feel encouraged to work as a police officer. As a result, about a year later, crime rates significantly skyrocketed, and now the city is struggling. The city council is trying to find ways to recruit those officers back into the police force to decrease crime. What message do you have for any current or future law enforcement listening to this interview, and how can they change the perspective of law enforcement in the future?
First, we hear you, we believe in you, we respect you, and we understand the difficult job that you have. For those coming into law enforcement, they have an awesome ability to really set an example and to show their community how valuable, important, and decent they are. And I think that is, really important as you welcome new law enforcement, new police officers into that thin blue line. It's important that they know that they too are part of ensuring not only our safety, but really changing the perspective that maybe some people have. And so I just would say to every man and woman in law enforcement, we love you, we respect you, we pray for you. May you always, always come home to a family that loves you and a community that supports you. And may we try more to ensure that you have the respect and support you deserve.
I'm sure those listening appreciate your very kind message. Ultimately, as a community, how do we trust the badge?
We talk more and we speak up more. When those want to undermine law enforcement, you've got to show up. I say to people, when somebody who's elected, if that person is making a decision that makes public safety more difficult or threatens community safety, you really ought to speak up. Use your microphone, whether it's on a podcast or at a town hall or city board meeting, and tell the elected official that you might share party affiliation with how important it is that they not back down in supporting public safety and the men and women in law enforcement. It's always important to tell the people that you agree with when they're wrong. It's equally important to tell the people you disagree with, but it is really powerful when you say to somebody you generally agree with that you're wrong. You need to step up. You need to speak out more on behalf of public safety and the people of law enforcement. And by having those conversations, they don't always have to be combative, but sometimes you got to speak loud. But the truth is, by having those conversations, we build the respect and the trust that we once had, that law enforcement ultimately deserves, and we have to ensure moving forward.
Well, it's great to know that we have legislators like you who care and support our law enforcement. So, for anyone listening from New York, know that if you're in the district of Congressman Molinaro, you are in good hands. Before we wrap up, do you have any final thoughts?
Well, just to encourage you, a lot of people don't use the voice they have, and sometimes we get intimidated to use that voice. And in a time and a place where there's a lot of other shouting, right? A lot of other people shouting, and there's platforms to keep people sort of either engaged or quiet. Use the voice you have, and you ought to be commended just for speaking out on behalf of what you feel passionately about, but also on really being a counterpoint to those who think undermining law enforcement is a good idea. It's not. And by using your voice, using this podcast, and encouraging people to listen, you're making a difference. So keep at it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Trust the Badge. Please follow at Trust the Badge on Instagram for updates, and follow Trust the Badge on any podcast platform such as Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube.